It is 13:51 on the afternoon of June 10th, 2024. Above the aerodrome at Haines Junction, Yukon, the summer air is clear and warm. A Cessna is on the downwind leg of a landing approach, low, slow, and less than a minute from the runway. The mountains the passengers came to see are behind them now. The ice fields, the glaciers, the slow blue rivers of ice descending from the continent's highest peaks. All of it recedes as the aircraft turns toward the strip of gravel that marks the end of the flight. The pilot has made this approach hundreds of times. At 13:51 and 13 seconds, the engine stops. The operator is a small Yukon-based sightseeing company running tours over the Kluane ice fields and Mount Logan. The aircraft is a 1982 Cessna U206G, a rugged, unpressurized six-seat utility plane well-suited to mountain flying, with no outstanding defects and a clean maintenance record. On board, the pilot and 5 passengers. The pilot holds a commercial license and 2,220.5 total flight hours, 214.5 on this type. He has been flying for the company on a seasonal contract for 9 years, making him one of their most senior pilots, and a training pilot, certified to assess other pilots' competency. By any reasonable measure, this is not someone unfamiliar with the risks of small aircraft flying in unforgiving terrain. The flight departs Haines Junction Aerodrome at 12:20 Mountain Standard Time, with approximately 42 US gallons of fuel on board, 24.5 gallons in the right wing tank, 17.5 in the left. The right tank is selected for departure. The plan is simple. Switch to the left tank on the return leg over Lowell Lake. Almost immediately after departure, clouds in the park force a route modification. The pilot adapts as experienced pilots do, keeping the aircraft clear of cloud while still giving the passengers a view worth the journey. By 12:44, the Cessna is climbing above 10,000 feet above sea level. At 13:08, it reaches its maximum cruising altitude, 12,950 feet above sea level. The aircraft is unpressurized. Every person on board breathes the same thinning air as the sky outside. There is no supplemental oxygen on board. Canadian regulations require supplemental oxygen for operations above 10,000 feet, lasting more than 30 minutes. The aircraft remains above 10,000 feet for approximately 40 minutes. Above 10,000 feet, the oxygen saturation of the blood begins to fall in ways that degrade thinking, memory, judgment, and reaction time, often without the affected person noticing. Investigators would later note that the pilot had frequently operated above 10,000 feet on prior tours without obvious consequence. Familiarity, in this context, may have been its own hazard. The aircraft descends below 10,000 feet at 13:24 and reaches Lowell Lake at approximately 7,000 feet above sea level 11 minutes later. This is the landmark the pilot has designated for switching tanks. The rest of the fuel plan depends on it. At approximately 13:36, the aircraft is over Lowell Lake at roughly 7,000 feet above sea level, turning north to follow the Alsek River back toward Haines Junction. The right tank has been selected for 1 hour and 16 minutes. This is the landmark. This is the moment the plan required switching to the left tank. Approximately 4 US gallons remain, a thin margin above the published unusable reserve. The aircraft turns north. The fuel selector does not move. In the descent that follows, the aircraft enters turbulence as it drops into the Lowell River Valley. The pilot rebriefs the passengers to tighten their safety belts. He notes a roughly 20-knot tailwind on an easterly heading. The aircraft is managing rough air, passenger comfort, and a modified route, all while the pilot conducts from memory the tasks a written checklist would have sequenced and confirmed. In the minutes before the final approach, the engine is running. The fuel gauge reads near empty on the right, and the before landing checklist sits untouched in the door pocket beside him. At 13:49, the Cessna joins a 5 nautical mile straight-in final approach for runway 05. The flaps are set to 10 degrees. Then the pilot looks at the windsock. From 3/4 of a nautical mile out, at a height of 300 feet above ground level, it is clear that the surface wind favors runway 23, the opposite direction. A company pilot on the ground will later describe the wind as from the west and quite strong. The pilot makes a sensible decision. He abandons the straight-in approach and maneuvers to join the right downwind leg for runway 23 instead. This is not a mistake. This is airmanship. and it is the last decision made in a position of full control. The aircraft climbs to a maximum of 400 feet above ground on the downwind leg. On a standard circuit, traffic flies the downwind at 1,000 feet or higher. At 400 feet, the aircraft is already low. It is 1350-42. The right fuel tank has now been selected for 1 hour and 30 minutes. It holds approximately 4 gallons. The Cessna U206G's before landing checklist has 7 items. Item 3 reads, Fuel Selector Valve, Fuller Tank. The checklist is stored in the pocket of the aircraft door adjacent to the pilot's seat. Investigators determined that the pilot routinely conducted operational procedures from memory rather than consulting the physical checklist. On this approach, as on many approaches before, he conducts his flow from memory. Item 3 is not completed. At 13:51:13, the engine ceases producing power. The silence is absolute and total. The pilot angles the aircraft toward the runway and reaches for the fuel selector, moving it from the right tank to the left. This is the correct action. The left tank holds 17.5 US gallons. He attempts to restart the engine, but the auxiliary fuel pump has not been activated. The aircraft manufacturer's restart procedure is explicit on this point. When fuel starvation occurs because a tank has run dry, the auxiliary pump must be switched on once the opposite tank is selected. Without it, the fuel system cannot purge the vapor-locked lines and deliver fuel to the engine quickly enough. The engine does not restart. 15 seconds have elapsed since power loss. It is now 13:51:28. The aircraft is at 300 feet above ground level, 600 feet laterally from the runway centerline. The pilot makes a decision, a 180-degree turn to land into the wind on runway 23. Straight ahead lies terrain and a tailwind landing that, in the pilot's assessment, risked a runway overrun. The runway is right there. It is familiar. It is where the flight was always supposed to end. Transport Canada's own flight training manual states plainly, numerous fatal accidents have resulted from attempting to turn back and land on the runway or aerodrome following an engine failure after takeoff. The warnings are written, the pattern is documented, and in the compressed urgency of 15 seconds at 300 feet with a silent engine and 5 passengers, the pilot turns toward the runway. The stall warning horn engages the instant the turn begins. It does not stop. The bank angle increases 20 degrees 30. The aircraft needs more lift to sustain the turn, but without engine power and at an already depleted airspeed, the only way to generate more lift is to increase the angle of attack. To pull back, the bank angle reaches 45 degrees. At 45 degrees in a 10-degree flap configuration, the Cessna's calibrated stall speed has already risen from 60 knots to approximately 71 knots. The bank angle reaches its maximum, 54 degrees. At 54 degrees, the stall speed is approximately 78 knots, a 30% increase from wings level. At 13:51:35, the aircraft stalls. The Cessna impacts the aerodrome infield at 13:51:38. In a slight right-wing low, flat pitch attitude. It noses over, it comes to rest inverted. Eyewitnesses and first responders reach the aircraft immediately. They extricate the occupants. CPR is administered to 1 passenger. The pilot and 4 passengers sustain serious injuries. 1 passenger, seated in the aft row on the right side, is fatally injured. The aircraft's manufacturer had noted that altitude loss during a stall recovery may be as much as 360 feet. The aircraft stalled at 300 feet above the ground. There was no post-impact fire. The engine, when examined at the TSB facility in Edmonton, showed no pre-existing defects. There was nothing mechanically wrong with this aircraft. The right fuel tank, drained post-occurrence, contained less than the published usable minimum. The left tank contained 17.5 US gallons. We know what happened. The harder question is why. The final investigation report identified 3 causes, each traceable to a distinct and compounding failure. Together, they map a chain of decisions that were individually understandable and collectively fatal. The first link was a missed checklist item. The pilot was experienced, current, and qualified. His reliance on memory rather than a physical checklist was not carelessness so much as confidence, the kind that accumulates with years of successful repetition. But the before-landing checklist exists precisely because memory is unreliable under cognitive load. Route modifications, passenger management, turbulence, a changed approach, a wind shift. The investigation could not establish that hypoxia caused the omission, but it could not rule it out. The pilot had spent 40 minutes above 10,000 feet without supplemental oxygen, and the residual effects of that exposure, documented to degrade memory and judgment for hours after descent, bear directly on why a 9-year veteran may have failed to complete a 7-item checklist he knew by heart. The checklist sat in the door pocket. Item 3 was never reached. The second link was an incomplete restart attempt. Switching fuel tanks alone is not sufficient to restart an engine that has been starved from a dry tank. The manufacturer's procedure requires the auxiliary fuel pump to be activated simultaneously. Without it, the fuel system cannot purge the vapor-locked lines and deliver fuel to the engine quickly enough. The engine did not restart. The third link was the turn. Aviation human factors research identifies a documented psychological hazard called the desire to save the airplane, the instinct to reach for the prepared surface, the runway, the controlled outcome, even when the energy to reach it is gone. At the moment the turn was initiated, the aircraft's low altitude, low airspeed, and powerless configuration were comparable to those of an aircraft immediately after takeoff. Investigators calculated that a straight-ahead landing was feasible from the point where the 180-degree turn was initiated. The pilot did not know this. He was working from instinct and the deeply human desire to put the aircraft down on pavement rather than in the trees. That instinct, in this case, was fatal.